empire's mass roundups and deportations of immigrants from Mexico is focused most intensely in lands stolen from Mexico. Those who die in the desert do so to get to a place once under the Mexican flag. Mexico's territory once stretched the southwest of what is now the United States, so large it covered what is today Texas, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, and California. Over 30,000 Mexicans lived in the area that is now New Mexico. Previously colonized by the Spanish Empire, the Mexican people won hard-fought independence in 1821. But anytime one empire is driven out, the vultures of another one began circling the newly freed nation. For manifest destiny marching west, Texas became the first battleground in the U.S. expansion in 1935. After Mexico abolished slavery in its territories, white settlers drove out Mexican forces and liberated Texas for slave owners. A decade later, they set out to conquer vast swaths of territory from Mexico. The Mexican-American War became the first time U.S. troops were sent to fight on foreign soil. Leading abolitionist Frederick Douglass set up the war. In the murder of Mexicans upon their own soil, or in robbing them of their country, I can take no part either now or hereafter. Many, including Henry David Thoreau, went to jail for refusing to pay taxes in protest of the war. In 1847, after 11 years of bloody battles, U.S. generals invaded and occupied Mexico City and secured the formal surrender of half of Mexico's northern territory, negotiated at the barrel of a gun. A new United States was born, carved by the swords of army officers, and the conquest of Mexican territory brought with it a new racist rule. In California, a whites-only constitution was employed. So began the legal assault of Mexicans living in what was their country. The burgeoning U.S. empire continued to shape Mexico's future. In 1910, the Mexican people began rebelling against a 35-year president, General Porfirio Diaz, who would let the U.S. and British capitalists plunder Mexico at the great expense of the Mexican people. When revolutionary Francisco Madero unseated Diaz's rule in 1911, the U.S. assisted in his assassination and a military coup. Among U.S. actions to ensure those friendly to U.S. business interests won out in the Mexican Revolution, President Woodrow Wilson bombed and occupied the port of Veracruz. By 1918, Nogales, a city split in two by the empire's new border, became a center of tensions, defined by dehumanizing and repressive treatment by U.S. forces. In one incident, an American soldier fired a shot while harassing a Mexican carpenter, setting off a major battle. As American troops invaded the Mexican side of Nogales as punishment, militiamen and civilians took up arms to repel them. The bloodshed came to a head when the mayor of Nogales, Felix B. Penaloza, came out with a white flag tied to a cane, calling on everyone to stop shooting. American forces shot the mayor dead. With that act, the terrorized leaders in Mexico surrendered, and the first permanent U.S. border fence was built. Not only does that wall remain today, but it's become an obscene scar that cuts a community in two. The population of Nogales, Arizona is 95% Latino, and it's historically linked to its sister city across the street. But since September 11th, 2001, Border Patrol has treated it like a war zone, as if they were soldiers guarding an outpost in Afghanistan. Since the border militarization, families divided by the wall have had to resort to visiting each other through the bars, the only way they can see and touch each other, despite living right next door. But even these caged reunions offend the cruelty of Border Patrol agents. When we went to the wall, approaching it within 10 feet was off limits. To find out more about how this ominous structure became what it is today, we spoke to Todd Miller, author of Border Patrol Nation, Dispatches from the Front Lines of Homeland Security.
Well, you could go back to 1924. That's when the Border Patrol was created. But for the first 70 years of its existence, all the way to 1994, they went from about 100 agents to 4,000 agents. This wall that we're looking at right here did not exist. It was a chain link fence. There's a lot of holes in it. There wasn't the technology that you see today. And then in the mid-1990s, actually this wall that is right behind us was constructed in March of 1994, and for those many people know that's 2 months after the implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement.
We have made a decision now that will permit us to create an economic order in the world that will promote more growth, more equality, better preservation of the environment, and a greater possibility of world peace.
The initiation of NAFTA in 1994, pushed under the guise of a free trade partnership with Mexico that would bolster the economy and curb immigration, did just the opposite. Heavily subsidized U.S. crops flooding in drove production down and consumer prices up. New corporations dominating the market collapsed small businesses across the country. Sweatshop labor surged. 28,000 small and medium-sized Mexican businesses were destroyed in NAFTA's first 4 years. The price of corn, Mexico's main staple, fell by 66%, ejecting at least 2 million small farmers from their land, forced to migrate north in search of life-sustaining work. NAFTA's model of neoliberal development forever stunts Mexico's food independence. In post-NAFTA Mexico, 42% of the food consumed comes in from abroad. As a result of this terrible policy, about 22 million Mexicans in a country of 122 million live in food poverty. The number of undocumented immigrants coming to America has increased a dramatic 185%, from 3.9 million in 1992 to 11.1 million in 2011.
What was called Operation Hold the Line, Operation Gatekeeper, and here Operation Safeguard were these three, operations that were put into place along the 2,000-mile U.S.-Mexico border right at the implementation of NAFTA in anticipation of this upsurge of immigration to then seal off the border in places that were traditional crossing places. If you look at U.S. empire, and you can look at U.S. empire in terms of U.S. interests, where U.S. economic interests are, military interests, or political interests, and it extends, So when you look at the United States in that sense, it's much bigger. It's a much bigger territory. In Central America, is a perfect example, and there's so much immigration is coming from Central America, but it's a perfect example of economic policy and militarization coming to a head, like Guatemala, United Fruit, really minor reforms by a president in Guatemala in 1954, boom, coup, a U.S.-sponsored coup comes up and removes that president, puts in a military dictatorship that lasts the next 40 years, right? The war in Guatemala, the kind of what they call a civil war, armed conflict, is very much defines this kind of imposed economic system and militarization system that the U.S., is very much a part of. And then instead of reconciling that, instead of looking for some sort of new way of going about things, what we've done, from immigration, when you think of immigration, there's many complicated reasons why people leave, and it's a very difficult thing for people to do. It's a very intimate decision for people to leave their families, their communities, the food they love, the language they speak, the people they love. It's not an easy thing for people to do. So when people do that, it comes from, real reasons around livelihood. It's usually a big sacrifice for their families, like thinking about their children going to school or even feeding their children. And so for the reaction to be like, for people coming north to build these walls and make their journey like very deadly, because of socioeconomic reasons and reasons of intense sacrifice normally for the families is something like, it's really kind of mind-blowing that this is happening, but it is. Here it is, and one of the reasons it does happen is because it's almost like the U.S. public is conditioned to think that this is protection, right? We're being protected by some sort of bad person or bad people that are out to get us, to steal things from us and whatnot. And the reality of the situation, it's the exact opposite. The United States, by its policies, have gone into places, stolen resources from people in many different cases, made it life really difficult for people to live, and then they migrate to the United States.
Hay leyes que dan libre tránsito a las cosas, pero marginan a las personas. Como hay tratados para aligerar las fronteras y puedan haber cruces rápidos, muy seguros para las cosas. Y cómo esos gobiernos que quieren esas leyes para las cosas de que se faciliten y puedan ir de una parte a otra con toda la facilidad, ellos mismos son los que ponen muros y hacen leyes que impiden el libre tránsito de los hombres y mujeres de nuestras comunidades. Ellos mismos provocan la expulsión de los pueblos. Ellos provocan esta migración que se da hoy, que es una forma de esclavitud moderna.
The economic devastation by NAFTA would have caused a refugee crisis on its own. But the empire's dirty wars across Latin America, in places like El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, have compounded it. The U.S. government has puppeted the most brutal dictators and death squads, only to deport the people fleeing the violence they created, even when deportation means death upon return. When the U.S. government wasn't waging war on populist movements, it was using drugs as the premise for military intervention. In Mexico, the bogus war on drugs has exploded to horrific proportions, where warring cartels and drug lords terrorize communities with near impunity. Between 2001 and 2014, there were more than 164,000 murders. U.S. drug policy that helped drug lords grow powerful, and Mexico's heavy violence to regulate them, is responsible for the blood-soaked crisis that so many are fleeing today. The big lie by the empire's rulers is that they don't want undocumented immigrants. See, in 2012, undocumented workers paid $11.8 billion in taxes, while the world's biggest corporations paid zero. But it goes far beyond money reaped from taxes. If all 11 million undocumented immigrants were removed from the U.S. today, it's estimated that the GDP would decline by a whopping $1.6 trillion. Businesses with undocumented workers make bonus profits by paying less than minimum wage and averting all standards for benefits and working conditions. Some industries survive off them primarily. The most profitable sector of the economy, agribusiness, uses more than 70% immigrant labor. About a half are undocumented. And the use of undocumented labor allows the big capitalists to keep wages low across the board for all people who work in the U.S. The reality is, the entire unjust, draconian system against immigrants could be ended sensibly by granting legal rights to everyone working in the U.S. It's not without precedent.
I believe in the idea of amnesty.
In 1986, sweeping amnesty was granted under Reagan to nearly 3 million undocumented workers. And as Bloomberg Business reports, more than 2 decades of research show that the 1986 law raised wages and helped lift the economy. The empire needs its millions of undocumented, but it also wants a heavy hand to keep these super exploited workers from standing up. They make easy scapegoats, too, when politicians have no other answers for the problems they've created. But all of the assault rifles, chains, and prisons can't hold back the tide of justice. Since the election of Obama, undocumented youth have led the movement against deportations and raids. With so much at stake for getting arrested, they've carried out civil disobedience actions across the country that have blocked ICE buses and streets. They do so under a brave slogan, undocumented and unafraid. But immigrants' true power was demonstrated most on May 1st, 2006, when they led the largest protest ever in U.S. history. 2 million took to the streets in response to a new anti-immigrant law. Millions more participated in a nationwide strike. A wave of actions shook the country for months. Big business in Washington are well aware of the sleeping giant in the U.S. economy. The people who they exploit, attack, and round up are the ones with the most power to change the system. In a country divided by a wall of racism, there are two sides. One that stands against the vicious injustice by a government that creates misery, then punishes its victims, and the other that will die in the dustbin of history.